MacArthur.
You said Jeremiah. But I knew who you meant because I've been keeping up with it.
John MacArthur. Why did I say Jeremiah?
I don't know.
Anyhow,
Similar.
he stood up to that governor.
Yeah.
He said, I'll take office from God, not seat.
Right.
I don't.
Jump through that radio.
I don't imagine they're gonna arrest John MacArthur, but they might.
I hope they do.
I
You
do
know
too.
what? God's gonna intervene.
I hope they do too. If they do, and it happens here, I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna say I want to be like John.
That's right.
I'm gonna give me a
And you'll
puppet
be in
ticket.
prison, you won't have to drive out there.
That's right.
You'll already be.
I'll already be there.
Yeah.
I think I'd lose my job.
I thought what he said was that's funny. I thought what he said was just so balanced because he said the state has authority, the church has its authority, the family has its authority. Sometimes those overlap, but in this situation, the state's just overstepping their authority to tell the church that they can't worship. You know? And he also brought up that there's no end in sight.
That's right.
Yeah.
Calvary in Vegas, they said that the Vegas can have 50% of their usual, 50% of 1,000, 50% of them, and that the churches in Vegas can only have 25. Calvary, there's a Calvary Chapel.
Oh yeah, it's huge.
And they said, and he said, told him the same thing.
Well, it really is kind of silly because if you shut down for this, then you've got to shut down for the flu every year because more people get the flu than they get this in California. It's only 0.002% of their population have been sick. And usually every year about 5% of the population in California gets a work stopping case of the flu. They miss work. So what do you do? If 5% are getting sick, are you going to just shut down everything and so that nobody gets sick? It's the stupidest thing I've ever heard.
Right. As Pastor was saying, they're just so stupid. What did Reagan say? It's not what they know, it's that what they do know is wrong. The Democrats, President Reagan, he said they know a lot of what they know. I'm not praising it verbatim, but it's just that what they do know is not right. And so they're trying to push on us.
Well, all
They're
our
the ones that are showing stupidity, not us. Huh.
all of our cyber people, there's only 3. They're listening to what we got to say about all this.
Oh, are they?
Yeah, that's all right.
Oh, it's good stuff, isn't it?
Yeah. But we're going to talk about Samuel here in a minute, once I get this going right. Because what we're going to do over the next, till the end of the year, and maybe longer, probably will be longer, is we're going to take a real quick look. It'll probably take us 35 weeks maybe. But what we're going to do is start with Samuel and go all the way through to the exile. And go through 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then we will do Kings and Chronicles in a parallel fashion. And so that'll take a little bit longer. And I hope that by doing this, it kind of helps us with the historical perspective because most people don't relate these 3 books very well to the prophets. And so we like reading the prophets, but we need to put it all in context. So my hope is that we do that with the historical account, and then we'll glean all the lessons that we can out of that, and then maybe we'll move right into the prophets or drop some of those in as we move through Kings and Chronicles, and do it that way. So it's a lot.
We don't have anywhere to go unless God says.
Yeah, I mean,
Which would be nice.
so I'm looking forward to it, and we won't do it like we've been doing, verse at a time, of course, but we'll take big hunks, and we'll hit the high points, and give the historical perspective, and then hopefully we'll build on all of that, and it's going to be really good. So I gave you some paper here. Hey, Kevin, come on in. There's some study notes there on the table. And what I did, I pulled some stuff out of my old seminary days for you to have. And this first sheet that you have is this, it's a general outline of the Old Testament history. It kind of gives an overview of time, and it shows, kind of in perspective. We're gonna pick up in the period between 1020 and 922 BC, and that's the time of Samuel, Saul, David, and Solomon, and then we'll go through the divided monarchy as well. So what we're planning on doing is covering a period of time from about 1200 BC all the way through to 445 BC. It's a lot of time there. So that kind of gives you the overall time. When you read these three books, it mentions a lot of cities and a lot of people. So there's a map in there too. This map, mine's color, and it didn't. I thought we had a color copy here, but we didn't. But this map kind of gives all the important cities and towns that are in Israel and Judea, both Old Testament and New Testament. So this is it doesn't have everything, of course, but it's got the major cities on it.
Just looking at these dots, like Goth and Shish, just from that dot to that dot, what do you think time-wise? Just for the heck of it.
Well, I can tell you from.
I'm talking about distance, not years or anything.
Yeah, I got you.
Get over there.
So
It's all close.
let's say. Well, the one thing not on here that's important to our study, Ramah. That's where Samuel's family was from, which was right north of Jerusalem. So from Ramah, which would have been between Jericho and Jerusalem, to Shiloh, would have been about 3 or 4 days. Okay. So, and the reason why it would have been that long is because that's rugged territory. The same distance along the plain from Ashdod to Joppa, the same amount of time, you would cover much greater distance, of course. So this is this is the area that Jesus was in.
Yeah,
And
it
is,
up here.
yeah, it's been said that from Capernaum to Jerusalem and back was about a 70-day journey.
Okay.
So I don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
because of the ruggedness,
Okay.
that seems like a long time for that journey, but
That's a long time. I mean,
Yeah.
what did they eat? You know,
had benefactors.
that followed them?
Yeah. The women in Jesus' life are given credit for having paid the way, you know. Then there is this timeline. It was in color too. I didn't look to see how it came out. I'm gonna find a better one though, because this one doesn't even look good in color. It's all I see now. It's all fuzzied up. But I'm gonna find you a good timeline that will show the kings, the prophets, the dates, the conquering kings, the whole deal. And I'm really disappointed in this, so I'll try to.
Readable. I mean, it's not unreadable.
Yeah, I'm gonna find another one. But that'll help, I'm hoping. And then finally, we have an overview of notes here dealing with Samuel. The notes cover 1st and 2nd Samuel. So we're not going to look through those tonight, but I wanted you to have them. And I won't follow this this particular outline. It's more of a theological outline, and it's helpful to use this along with what we'll be doing. So keep it close, keep it in your Bible and stuff, and we will use it as we go along. I do want to look at the part A though, on that first sheet, which would be page 1. It says Samuel at the top. Um, it states that these books develop differently than the other history material that we find, the Deuteronomistic history material. There are three different identifiable phases in Samuel. There's the individual stories or tribal narratives that were probably circulated independently. The tribal narratives were gathered in several collections. Samuel would have been one, Nathan another, Gad another, or larger units that combined traditions of similar subject matter. And then the final step was the process of compiling these various collections into the Deuteronomistic history, and they believed that it was all compiled around the 6th century BC. The compilers did this with very little editorial comment. So they took all this material that had been collected over hundreds of years and they just stuffed it together into a volume, okay, without much editing at all. So we have material from the period, but the final form of it was not put together until much, much later, probably during the exile, something like that. Okay, so the author is named Samuel. It's after the main character in this book, or the main character, he's the main thread that is carried through most, certainly through the first book. He's primarily responsible for the establishment of the monarchy in Israel. So Samuel sounds like heard of God, Shemuel in Hebrew. According to a late but unlikely Hebrew tradition, it was written by Samuel. Samuel may be composed from several sources, later pieced together by an editor. So that's what I just talked about. The Shemuel also could mean the name of God, or one called of God. There's all sorts of different possibilities. But when we look at the story, we understand why the one that is listed here is the best, heard of God. Samuel is one of the 5 books in the Deuteronomistic history. It records the story of one of the most crucial transitional periods in Israel's history, a period of dramatic social change and reconfiguration of political structure. Israel moved from a loosely organized group of tribes, which is what the judges were dealing with. Samuel's the last judge, okay, to a tightly controlled, centralized authority, personalized in a king, okay, which is significant. We'll discuss that as we go along. So 1st and 2nd Samuel form one book in the Hebrew canon, as do 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So if you look at a Hebrew edition of the Old Testament, you're not going to find 1st and 2nd Samuel. You're going to find Samuel, you're going to find Kings, you're going to find Chronicles. A copy found at Qumran at the Dead Sea Scrolls is a single scroll. And what he means by single scroll, all 6 of what we have in our Bible was in one scroll. So quite a history collected in one scroll. It was divided by the Greeks to make the length of the scroll more manageable. The Greek division into 2 books was kept in later editions. And then there's a little outline there of Samuel, which we will follow, but we'll break it down even further as we study. And then that's what we're going to look at there. So that's just a little overview. Any comments, questions about that at all? Okay. So generally, the first three chapters is basically the establishment of Samuel and his role. The fourth chapter speaks of the Philistines, which was the major driver in the community. And then finally, when we get through to chapter 7, that really is kind of the introduction where they finally get to the place of naming a king or demanding a king. So let's do this. Let's read beginning with verse 1. We'll just read through 18.
First one book.
Yeah, 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 1. And we'll stop and go along the way. There was a man from Ramah, and that's all I'm going to say. If you look at that name, it's even shortened on the maps to mean Ramah. Ramathaim Zophim. I don't even know if that's even right. In the hill country of Ephraim. His name was Elkanah, son of Jeroham, son of Elihu, son of Tohu, son of Zuph, an Ephraimite. He had 2 wives, the first named Hannah and the second Peninnah. Peninnah had children, but Hannah was childless. This man would go up from his town every year to worship and sacrifice to the Lord of armies at Shiloh. So, during the time of Judges, the ark had made its way to Shiloh, and there was its home, and that's where people would go to worship. Okay, so there was only one place that you worshiped, and that was where that was, and that's where everyone went. That's where Eli's 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, were the Lord's priest. Okay, Eli was there with his sons. Whenever Elkanah offered a sacrifice, he always gave portions of meat to his wife Peninnah, to each of her sons and daughters, but he gave a double portion to Hannah, for he loved her, even though the Lord had kept her from conceiving. Her rival, meaning the other wife, would taunt her severely just to provoke her, because the Lord had kept Hannah from conceiving. Year after year, when she went up to the Lord's house, her rival taunted her in this way. Hannah would weep and would not eat. "Hannah, why are you crying?" her husband Elkanah would ask. "Why don't you eat? Why are you troubled? Am I not better to you than 10 sons? On one occasion, Hannah got up after they ate and drank at Shiloh. The priest Eli was sitting on a chair by the doorpost of the Lord's temple. Deeply hurt, Hannah prayed to the Lord and wept many tears. Making a vow, she pleaded, "Lord of armies, if you will take notice of your servant's affliction, remember and not forget me, and give your servant a son. I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and his hair will never be cut." While she continued praying in the Lord's presence, Eli watched her mouth. Hannah was praying silently, and though her lips were moving, her voice could not be heard. Eli thought she was drunk and said to her, "How long are you going to be drunk? Get rid of your wine." "No, my lord," Hannah replied. "I am a woman with a broken heart. I haven't had any wine or beer. I've been pouring out my heart before the Lord. Don't think of me as a wicked woman. I've been praying from the depth of my anguish and resentment." And Eli responded, "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant the request you've made of him." "May your servant find favor with you," she replied. Then Hannah went on her way. She ate and no longer looked despondent. So when we look at the story, of course, out of this, we'll see in a moment that Samuel is born. So when we look at the background story to Samuel coming into the world and then being chosen by God, even before he was born, really, to be the person who would bring about the monarchy in Israel. how do we see God setting the stage here? What stands out to you about this whole narrative?
Just really.
You know, we don't want to get ahead.
Oh, there's a book here.
That's a cricket.
Oh,
Well, she was
I'm sorry.
in agony. She was tormented. She couldn't get away from her tormentor because of the family situation. And every time she looked at this woman, even if she wasn't saying anything to her, it was undeniable that she was having children and Hannah wasn't having children. Okay, all she wanted to do was please the Lord and please her husband. Okay, and just like everybody else who's been broken, she finally broke down and she prayed to the Lord with all of her heart that she would have this son. Okay, and not as not trying to make a deal with the Lord. She just swore that she would give that child to him and raise him as his child and keep him inside of the Lord's ways.
So there's there's two things. There's justice. She's asking for some justice. She wants her life to matter. When we seek justice in any way, we're saying that I've been wrong, but I want my life to matter. I want it to matter to somebody. And so,
He loved her more than he loved that other woman.
yeah.
She was barren.
So that's right. So he loved his wife. Elkanah loved his wife. Okay. But there's an identity in us, and it happens in all of us, that we want to be more.
Okay, she didn't have to prove anything to him.
No. She didn't have to prove anything to him.
She wanted God, favor of God.
She's not proving anything to anyone. She just wants God's favor. And in this culture, as is in the New Testament, we see the same thing in the story of the rich young ruler. And as we are so readily convinced by some preachers today, which is kind of out of bounds, but your worth is how God is viewing you. How blessed are you? Okay? And so that's what she's struggling with. Am I of no concern to God? That I have no blessing? My husband's love for me is one thing, but the blessing of God is quite another. And so she wants the blessing from God. She doesn't want to lose the love of her husband naturally, but she wants.
He was in despair for her, and she turned around and prayed for God to help him.
She prays.
He was upset. She was upset.
In a sense, that's it. She didn't say that in her prayer.
No.
But there's something missing there, and God is central to it. And she knows that. And so she goes and she prays this prayer. Now, the other wife, she's been blessed, but really doesn't recognize, right? If you flaunt your blessing in the face of others that don't have it, then it's no longer a blessing, it's a curse.
You got two different personalities.
Right. And so really the other wife is operating from a sense of piety and a sense of shame upon the other. And all that Hannah wants is to enjoy the blessing of God in a way that is significant to her life. It could have been anything, but it was not anything. It was being able to have a son. Okay, so she makes this. She offers this prayer not as a bargain with God, but saying that the greatest gift that you can give to me, I'm willing to give back to you. So there's this flow of giving. It's the same concept of grace. Grace always begets grace. If you receive grace and you know it's grace, then you're going to offer it to someone else or to something or some other situation.
Mhm.
And so that's what we have here. And that's Hannah, and that's her heart. And we love Hannah. We love the story of Hannah because she's so honest about the situation. And so often we encounter people that if they could just get to the point of being honest with God about the situations in their life, that something could actually be done about it. But most people rarely get to that place of honesty with God, and so they continue to fight the same.
Well, that would be
It's like wrestling with the tar baby.
Banana. She, well, she did a lot of work. She bore all those children. She had to raise them. She had to bring them up and feed them and take care of them. And she wasn't appreciated the way that Hannah was. I mean, she was doing all the work, and Hannah was getting she was getting twice as much food. She was getting all this stuff. So she hated her. She was resentful.
Well, Elkanah may have been
That's
trying
probably
to.
why she attacked her in those ways.
Well, could be.
We gotta,
But we don't want to read too much.
modern day is, we gotta either save them or not.
No, you gotta
Well-
think about, because we always look at the villain as the villain, but you really have to think sometimes of what brought that person to that position.
Well, she didn't have the faith that Hannah had,
Her husband knows the pain. And what's the best he can do? I'm going to give you 2 portions of meat. You know, that's as good as a human effort can do in a situation like that. I mean, Elkanah can't make her have a child. You know, that's all in God's hands. So the best that he can do is really kind of pitiful, but it's the best that he has to because of his love for her. And the writer makes sure that we know that. He's not doing it out of pity for her. He's doing it out of love for her. Yeah. And then, all right, so then we get to the other picture here, and there's Eli sitting by the gate of the temple. And she's over there and she's praying. You know, they've made their sacrifice, and she's praying, and Eli's watching. And what's his first thought?
She must be drunk.
She must be
Yeah.
drunk. Okay. So how low had worship become in Israel in that day?
yeah.
To where the priest assumes that when someone's, they're actually praying and muttering to themselves a prayer to God, and his first assumption is, there's another drunk here at the temple. Okay, so there's this degradation that has occurred again in the nation of Israel, where the assumption is that, and he has good reason to assume it, because we find out later his own sons are worse than that. Okay, and they're the priest in this temple. And so he first assumes, and then he does what it should be his priestly duty, and he goes and he confronts her about her drunkenness. When are you going to put down your wine and approach the altar of God sober? And he does what he should do to his sons, but we don't ever find that he does. And he does to her. And so then she has to bear the whole thing to him. Okay? So he really, for a brief moment in this whole story, he really does become a priest. He's doing exactly what the function of a priest is supposed to do. Listen to the hearts of the people and offer it to God. And that's what he does. You know, he hears her, and he says, "Go in peace. May the God of Israel grant the request you've made of him." Okay. The other thing that we find in here, she doesn't tell him the whole prayer that she's prayed for a son, but she does say that I'm living under this depth of anguish and resentment in my soul. And so, like you were saying, Kevin, she knew that she could go to God and unload that. That was a part of her worship to God. that was akin to being able to confess your sin, was also being able to confess the result of sin upon your life. Lord, this is not right for me. And there are times in all of our lives where we go to God and we should be able to say, this just isn't right for me. This isn't supposed to be this way for me. And it's because of others. That's not trying to push it off on somebody else. That's just stating the truth of things. Sometimes life is just no good.
Your circumstances.
Just the
Beyond your
circumstances,
control.
they're just bad. And you want somebody to hear, and here's God. The same God that told shoot. Who was it? Who was it? Sarah's handmaiden that Hagar. Hagar got turned down, and she said, this isn't any fault of my own. But she said, the God who sees me answered my prayer. And so this is Hannah, the same thing. The God who sees me is answering my prayer. He's hearing what I've got to say. And then the priest is able to reaffirm that for her. Not knowing what she prayed, just knowing the sincerity of her heart. And he says to her, may the God of Israel grant the request you made of him. And then how does this little section end? She went back to the worship festival and she ate, and she no longer looked miserable, despondent, like there was no meaning for her life.
She knew God is.
She had an encounter with God. And she didn't yet know the answer, but she knew what she had experienced. You see, the answer comes later, but she knew what she'd experienced in this moment. And sometimes we get so hung up on the answer that we forget that the most important thing may have been the experience we've had with God in trying to solicit an answer. Does it make sense?
Good. That's good. Yeah.
That's true. I'm still convinced that when Jesus prayed in the garden, he didn't get the answer he wanted. But he had been with God and he knew God's will in the situation.
Yeah.
And more than anything else, he wanted God's will more than his own.
Not my will, but thine.
Yeah. And so the encounter that he has is what makes all the difference. You can move from what you want to what he wants by appreciating the encounter with God. But to do it legalistically, okay, I know that I'm supposed to surrender mine and I know that I'm supposed to take on his, and you try to do that mechanically and legalistically, you can't do it. It's just like, you just want to wash it down and spit it out. You don't want it. But when you've encountered God in it, and you leave no longer despondent, but you're satisfied, that's when you know that's when you know it's really happened for you.
And that's our prayer today when we pray.
That's exactly right.
We can
Because
sit
God
there and
doesn't
pray all day
change.
long if our heart's not in it.
That's right. That's right.
We're not gonna feel that.
Well, you carry that weight,
Yeah.
and until you release it,
That's right.
then how can you be happy? You can't find
She
joy
didn't let her.
when you're carrying. Like you said that she was shamed by this woman.
Yeah.
So she was carrying around shame.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
man, there's nothing heavier
That's the
than
worst.
shame.
Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, she's bent over with it. Like she's carrying
It was
around a
taking
bag
her
of
down,
bricks.
but she went in prayer and had the encounter, which assured her that God heard her.
Mhm.
Something was gonna happen.
So the backdrop
Well,
is,
even if it doesn't happen, she told God about it. She really told God about it. She didn't pray mechanically like you were saying. She told God about
Heart,
it.
soul.
And her heart, that Shema or whatever you want to call it, that even when you scream at God, if you're screaming with God with all of your heart,
Yeah.
isn't He going to hear it?
Yeah.
You know, but it wasn't the answer. It was like you said, the encounter. You know, she got to let that all out.
He took it
Ye-
from,
Yeah,
And it was so noticeable that somebody else thought she was drunk.
so we have in here the beginning of a backdrop. And we find in this that there's some injustice that's here. There's some anguish that's going on here. There's a misappropriation of worship that that not on behalf of Elkanah and his family, but on the expectation that we find in Eli when he's there trying to figure out what she's doing. So there's a lot of unsettledness and nothing that you would think would be the backdrop for bringing forth a great prophet, that the last judge and prophet. Yeah.
Dysfunctional. He's born into a dysfunctional relationship. I mean, family with. I mean, in a dysfunctional village.
Yeah, in a nation that really needs a lot of help. So the next morning, verse 19, Elkanah and Hannah got up early to worship before the Lord. Afterward, they returned home to Ramah. But then Elkanah was intimate with his wife Hannah, and the Lord remembered her. After some time, Hannah conceived and gave birth to a son. She named him Samuel because she said, I requested him from the Lord. My note for Samuel says it sounds like the phrase requested of God or heard of God or named of God. Okay. So she names him, she basically names him Samuel, acknowledging that God heard her. When Elkanah and his household went up to make the annual sacrifice and his vow offering to the Lord, Hannah did not go and explain to her husband, after the child is weaned, I'll take him to appear in the Lord's presence and to stay there permanently. Her husband Elkanah replied, do what you think is best and stay here until you've weaned him. May the Lord confirm your word. So Hannah stayed there and nursed her son until she weaned him. When she had weaned him, she took him with her to Shiloh, as well as a 3-year-old bull, half a bushel of flour, and a clay jar of wine. Though the boy was still young, she took him to the Lord's house at Shiloh. Then they slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. Please, my Lord, she said, as surely as I live, my Lord, I am the woman who stood here beside you praying to the Lord. I prayed for this boy, and since the Lord gave me what I asked him for, I now give the boy to the Lord. For as long as he lives, he is given to the Lord. And they worship the Lord there. So, God's good by his word, and Hannah's good by her word.
what does that mean by lent?
Where?
She gave him to the Lord. That's the very last sentence. It shall be lent to the Lord, so they worship the Lord there, so she lent.
That's what you reading out of?
King James.
Yeah, that's why.
What did yours say?
Now I give the boy to the Lord.
Okay, that sounds good.
And so, I could get into the whole Hebrew lesson and I'd probably get it wrong since I didn't do very well on
That's
Hebrew.
okay, I was like,
But different forms of the same word can be used different ways.
Well, it says here,
And,
it doesn't mean temporarily, but give a.
Yeah.
I think another thing here, it's funny that it's been going over my mind over and over again for the longest time, is the importance of the blood. The importance of blood. I mean, if you want to consider what the most powerful liquid on earth is blood. Okay, God doesn't care about gold or silver or gems. He cares about blood.
Right.
Okay, it
Deuteronomy
says here
says
that
life
she
is
brought
in it.
this 3-year-old bull. Okay, something that, okay, an animal really can't sin. Not in my opinion, it can't sin. All it can do, as a matter of fact, this animal eats grass. It doesn't even kill.
Right.
Okay, so she's bringing in something that hasn't committed, because this goes all the way down to Christ. This is something that didn't commit any sin, that was slaughtered to seal this arrangement, to the covenant. There's a covenant made here. She had promised the Lord that she was going to deliver this child, and she's delivering the child. She's
Right, keeping her into the
she's-
covenant.
she's
Yeah,
honoring her end of it, and blood had to be shed in order for that to be
that's right.
a satisfactory thing for God.
Right.
Okay, because nothing matters to God except for the blood.
And why is that? Hebrews reminds us from Deuteronomy that there's life in the blood.
Nothing else. There's like nothing else.
Yeah. And so we're reminded every time an animal was slaughtered, it was a reminder that, you know, the life is here. It's once it's gone, there is no life left in us. Yeah. And God very appropriately from our end of things chose to use such an act and such a symbol to remind us of our own mortality.
You know what really brought me to that was I don't know if you remember. It had to be 10 years ago. We went to Secret Church.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was like 12 years ago.
One Life was having it
Yeah.
at that time. 10 or 12 years ago. Shoot, and it was all about the Old Testament, and what it all came down to was the covenants that were made.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and every covenant involved blood. Okay, but nothing was satisfactory. Nothing lasted. You see, because it goes on to the new covenant that we live under.
Right.
Okay, where there was no satisfactory being to sacrifice for this covenant.
Right.
There was nothing. There was no sinless man.
Yeah, it would have had to been offered over and over again, because the sacrifice that was given for us lives.
So God had
So
to
there's
come.
no need
A
for
part
another
of God
sacrifice.
came down here as a sinless man.
Yeah.
That was the only. So God had to provide. God had to provide the sacrifice.
Right. And he also provided the altar upon which it was made, and he provided the priest that made the sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
Our hands are completely off of it, because had we been required to do anything, it would have been sinful, and it would have mattered. And so he does it all for us, and then just says, here, take and eat and drink, and it's available to you if you want it. And nobody's made to take it. And we're living in a world today that's proof of that, and thank God it's that way. If it had been probationary, or if it had been in some sort of way legalized to where you had to do it, then really what would we do with it still? We would corrupt it in some sort of way. But when you receive it freely, you've got no reason at all to corrupt it. And yet we still do. It's just in our nature to take something that's good and corrupt it. But at least we get to ask forgiveness for it. Those without it can't even ask forgiveness. And I don't know how they live a day. So in this particular section, there's not a whole lot here that we glean from this other than what we've been discussing. The covenant that we keep matters, and the expectations that we have of God matter. Okay. We could look at the backstory and believe that Hannah could conceive because she was now ready to conceive. But it may, and it probably is, exactly what we know for it to be when we read, is that God provided everything that Hannah had requested. So she goes and she brings the sacrifice, and she makes the sacrifice. She gives the boy to Eli, and he says he's going to live here and serve the Lord here in this place. And then it says, so he and it also could say they. In some other manuscripts it says she. So I tend to use the words they. And they both worship because of what God had done and because of the gift of Samuel. And then we have the hymn in chapter 2. And this is kind of in couplet form. We want to go through and just look at the contrast that are being laid out here. So it's kind of like Mary's song, Magnificat, and this is kind of the same thing. There's two sides presented all the way through this. And this is another picture of God saying, see how I do things? I take things and I just turn it all upside down. I take what you think is wrong and I'm going to make it right. And he does this over and over again in history. And we see it over and over again as we move through the rest of this whole history that we're going to look at. So Hannah prayed, my heart rejoices in the Lord. My horn is lifted up by the Lord. My mouth boasts over my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. So she is singing this hymn and she relates having this child to salvation. That this is a pinnacle in her life. This is the relationship with God that has provided everything to her. Salvation for us. It's our relationship with God through Christ that provides everything for us. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one beside you. There is no rock like our God. So she has holiness, and there is the idea of rock or foundation or the immovability of God. So he is holy and he's steadfast, he's immovable, and I've been with him, and he's given me this great thing, this child that is the equivalent of salvation. In a real sense, Samuel was sort of the kind of judge and prophet that at least guided his people to an idea of what it meant to truly be with the Lord, although they kept rejecting it and wanting their own way. It says, do not boast so proudly or let arrogant words come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and actions are weighed by him. So what's this couplet say in verse 3? Be careful with your heart. Okay? Don't be so proud. Don't be so boastful. Don't be so arrogant. And certainly don't let it be known, because God is the God of knowledge. He knows your heart. Okay? And the actions that you undertake as a result of your boastful, arrogant heart, okay, are going to be weighed by him. You may be offering, you may have a heart that satisfies you, and you may do things that you believe are going to be beneficial to you or to gain the favor of others, but God knows what's going on here. Okay, so she could easily be speaking to her adversary, the other wife, okay, but she could also be speaking a warning for herself, okay, or it may just be a hymn that speaks to the arrogance and boastfulness of a nation that feels like that because they've been chosen by God, they can pretty much do whatever they want.
Is she on the one in there praying this?
Well, it's a prayer of her, yeah. So
I'm saying that this could be for
yeah,
the group.
it certainly is provided for the consumption of everyone.
I don't think this is a prayer to the Lord. I think it's a prayer to the people, I think.
There was other people you think in the room?
Well, it's
No.
something for us to live by, that's for sure. This is wonderful, man. I didn't know this. I haven't read Samuel enough to know this. I don't remember that.
The bows of the warriors are broken, okay, but the feeble are clothed in strength. So now we get to these couplets these parallels. So she's saying here, this Lord that we worship, this God that provides all that we need, he breaks the bows of the warrior, but the feeble are clothed in strength. So if you're weak, God's going to clothe you with strength. If you're strong by your own strength, God is going to break you down. Those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are starving hunger no more. So what to say it is, a person that's a glutton is always going to be a glutton. They always want more. The more they have, the more they want. So you can be full, but you're still going to go get more money. You still want more. You want more. You want more. I was reading this earlier today, and I was thinking, you know, last Monday, Jeff Bezos made $14 billion in one day. 14 with 9 zeros behind it. In one day, just his stock trading on the internet, on the stock market, he made $14 billion. And I'm thinking, this guy's, he's really fat. He's full. But he still wants more. And the Psalm says, okay, but those who are starving, they're not going to be hungry anymore. So what's this sound like? Anybody, does this ring Beatitudes in Matthew at all? Okay. Yeah. So it's stating the truth about God. If you take care of yourself all you want, there's always going to be opportunity for more, but it's not going to satisfy. You let God take care of your feebleness, and you're going to be full. Okay. And that's what she's saying here in this hymn. Those who are feeble, weak-kneed, limp-wristed, can't really get around, God will provide you your strength. You don't have to worry.
Blessed are the meek.
Yeah. Let's see. The woman who is childless gives birth to 7, but the woman with many sons pines away. So the one who's childless, God's going to provide you with a pedagogy. You're going to be okay. 7, by the way. It's going to be full and complete, perfect. Okay? But the woman who has many sons, or like the woman who has taken pride in her sons, she's going to find her days pining away. What's that mean? She's alone. When you pine, you're yearning, you're longing. You're basically alone. So these things are set against each other. The Lord brings death and gives life. He sends some down to Sheol, and he raises others up. The Lord brings poverty and gives wealth. He humbles and he exalts. So meaning that, well, let's just go on. He raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the trash heaps. Or through verse 7, it's just basically saying that name one thing that God doesn't have control over. That's the challenge. Just name one thing. I mean, he's got control over where you go when you die. He's got control over poverty. He has control over wealth. He has control over humility. He has control over arrogance. He has everything. He raises up the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the trash heap. He seats them with noblemen and gives them a throne of honor. Okay, so here we have that there's a sense of justice and there's a sense of equality that comes about because God designs it that way. The poor can't force their way into the rich man's table. It's just not going to happen. All this business that's going on about racial equality and all of that, you try to force that to happen, you've got nothing. You've just got a paper tiger. You've got a straw man, because nobody's going to have respect for it, because it doesn't come about for any real purpose other than somebody said, well, this is what's just or this is what's right. They say abortion's just and right. You just can't take the two and add it up and say, just because you say it's just and right makes it right. It's got to come from somewhere.
Well, then they
And-
can themselves God.
And precisely. And so where does it come from? It always and only can come from God. We can't manufacture it no matter how hard we try. No matter how bad we want it, we cannot do it. But God can do it. Because He is the one that lifts up and places them at the table with everyone else. Because He's the one that is just. And He has control over all these things. But I'm convinced the longer I live, He doesn't do a thing until we ask Him to.
Well, that's a fact.
Importance of prayer.
That's a fact.
I think the world believes either they don't believe in Him at all, or God's just going to finally have enough and do something. I would rather get on the same page with Him, or do like Jesus says when He teaches us about prayer, just be persistent in what we would like to have with Him. And then He finally becomes weary of us and He provides it. You know? But this idea that we're just going to sit here and wait for something to happen and then say, well, it's God's will, I don't think He appreciates that at all. That's no
not-
relationship
no,
at all.
That's not what's going on right now. It's ignorance.
Well,
Lack
much of what we
knowledge.
see, but I haven't heard a national call of prayer
Well,
from the
Billy Graham. Billy Graham.
oh, Billy Graham's
Franklin
gone.
Graham, Franklin Graham.
If Billy Graham called for prayer,
I hear it every
I'm
day.
sorry I missed that one. I would like to heard that one.
Franklin does come on every day,
Yeah.
2 or 3 times a day on 88.1, and he says this is a heart condition.
Yeah.
It's not anything but people's hearts that are not lined up with God.
Yeah. Well,
So-
but my point is, where is the Billy Graham of today? Who would it be if you just had to choose one?
His son right now is the only one I think of. All he's doing
I know,
for the
but
grace of God.
Yeah,
but he is not, and it doesn't need to be one person. That's what I'm trying to get around here. It is Christians rising, just like what you're doing, Ann, or organizing this prayer meeting in Denham Springs. That needs to happen 1,000,000 times in our country. See,
All over. the
all
country.
over.
But you don't
That's what
think
God's
Frank-
waiting on.
You
See,
don't think Franklin's doing gathering? I mean, he has the crusades. He goes all over the world. You don't think he's following in his daddy's footsteps? You breaking my heart.
no. Look, I take nothing away from his
I
work.
think he's awesome.
I take nothing away from his work, but it's not one man, and that's the point I'm trying to get to. When we look and we say, who is it on the who out there on the landscape is making this call that we need to get with God in this, whatever that is. And what I'm saying is, if we're waiting on one person to do it, then we're making a huge mistake as believers, as individual believers. We need to all be standing, and we need to
How do
all
you
be
do that?
saying,
I mean,
well,
people-
you are doing it.
we're
and-
all
and then-
crumbling around us, and everybody just.
And
oh.
and see, I'm in a weird spot because 2 days a week, I mean, I pray with condemned people, and so my situation is different. We pray. I pray more for my country and what is happening in jail than I do outside of jail. It's really strange when I think about it now. But my point is that God does this when we acknowledge that He's the one that can do it and will do it. But what I hear more than anything else is a lot of scurrying around figuring out what we can do.
Well,
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's
it's
figure out
not-
what we can do. Am I?
It's so much easier to talk about
To not
these
be.
things. Just talk with your friends about it and be upset than it is to actually pray.
Yeah.
And
So-
you're right. Usually the conversation's focused on like, okay, what's the solution?
Because we've got to be smart enough to get the solution right.
So example, Saturday, I was with 17 of my family members who all claim to be Christians. But I'm the only one that's not a Catholic, you know,
Right.
in the whole bunch, was a Catholic. I left that little party for this mobility challenged 21-year-old
Right.
niece. And I was on my way home and I just started crying. As I had a couple incidents with my daughter. But that was not one of us prayed.
Hmm.
Out of 17 Christians, nobody said, let's pray before.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that has just haunted me.
And see
I was part of that group.
yeah. And you rewrite.
Exactly what he's saying.
Yeah. We rewind back and in the Jewish family, first century, earlier, a little bit later, the family prayed every time they were together. Yeah. And then you move into because see, we approach God today as the guy that's going to fix our problems. And if we believe we're able to take care of our own problems, our own need, we don't need to pray. It's not said out loud, it's not even thought subconsciously, but that's what happens. Okay, and as what we were saying a while ago, prayer is for what? Is it always for something, or is it just to be with God?
Look what it did for this woman that was living in total despair.
Yeah.
That one deal and
Yeah.
one time and praying to God. And look
And-
what came out of her.
Right.
And she submitted.
Yeah.
We don't submit.
So we don't pray because, hey man, I know how to fix. I've got my problems pretty much under control.
Oh yeah, I got this.
You know, that guy needs to pray. His life's a wreck, but not me. I mean, I'm okay. I'll pray for him.
There you go.
You know, I'll do that because then that's pretty. And the whole time God's saying, wait a minute, what about you and me?
Yeah, that's a fantastic point. Like we just think God's all about solving a problem.
Yeah.
If we can solve them, we don't need them. I think it just like shows the lack of worship.
Yeah.
Like even in this prayer, she's talking about, it's brought on by God helping her. But I mean, it's a worshipful song.
Yeah.
Just about, the power and the presence of God and control of God. Like we lose that reverence and the fact that we need to worship God, not just asking for things.
So one of the things that I think that happens in the 21st century anyway, where we are today, Christians will often acknowledge God and will even acknowledge Jesus as Savior and maybe possibly even as Lord, but they never approach His holiness.
They
That
don't
never,
wait around long
that
enough.
never really comes up. Because is that really required for me to be in a saving relationship with Jesus? Well, yeah, it does. You can kind of put it to the side and say, after I'm saved, I can approach that. But if all you have to do is be saved, then you really never have to. And so we miss God completely. Because we begin to say, that's enough, but I really don't have to approach His holiness. And then I go back to Isaiah in chapter 6 of Isaiah, where he's in the temple, and the first thing he experiences is the holiness of God. And that's what causes him to know that he needs to be saved. Not that he looks introspectively and says, oh man, if I keep living like this, I'm going to go to hell when I die. I might need to be saved. And so people start thinking that way. And the church is guilty of having them think that way.
Being raised Catholic,
Because-
nobody ever taught me how to be saved.
Yeah.
Nobody taught me how to be baptized and make my first communion.
Right,
And
right.
make my confirmation. But
Well-
you can't talk to a Catholic, even Donald, and
Yeah.
say, this is the way you be saved. by
Right.
Professing God.
Yeah.
They think because you did those 3 little rituals,
Yeah,
you're going to heaven.
yeah.
Yeah,
And see,
I
and
know.
my point is, imagine if what we wanted was the holiness of God. But then you would realize the depth of your
Do you
sin
think
and the
people
need.
know there's such a thing?
No, because the church doesn't talk a lot about God's
Can you
holiness.
tell me, when you're standing up there preaching, as you did Sunday, from the heart, from the soul, people didn't feel that?
I don't know. I know Sunday was one of those unique days. I mean, I wish it was like that every week.
I
but-
mean, you sat, were you here?
No,
Well, it was very unusual because, I mean, he cries sometimes, but he cried all the time. You
Come
know,
on
it was
now.
such an emotional frame of mind that he was in. But then I'm sitting there and I'm thinking, are people feeling that?
Yeah, and
Do they know what that is? Do they know what it is to
well,
talk about God and weep?
yeah, Robert Smith, who's a preaching professor at Beeson Divinity School, says that a good sermon stirs up a hurricane in a person's soul,
That's beautiful.
and boy, you strive for that, and some weeks you feel like you have, and it's crickets. You don't get anything back, and then other weeks you have what we had Sunday, where I could tell that people were
Feeling it.
dealing with something. Everybody, I felt like everybody was.
Well, we had that little boy come up. That was
yeah.
beautiful.
Yeah,
I mean, he didn't have, he could have waited till next Sunday.
yeah.
Or
I hope he's back. I haven't been able to get a hold of him this week.
he'll be back.
Yeah.
I gave him a book.
Okay.
He was parked next to me. I said, boy, you don't know me, but I got something for you. And it was a daily devotional. I carried him in my purse.
Yeah.
So I said, and you read this year,
Good.
so it's something that will encourage him. But
All right, we're gonna move on. Last part of 8 says, "For the foundations of the earth are the Lord's. He has set the world on them." So we finally get to this place where everything that the earth, everything that happens on the earth, everything that is driven by men, it's the Lord's. He has set the world on those foundations. He guards the steps of his faithful ones, but the wicked perish in darkness. So we have this picture. How does he guard the steps of those that are faithful? They're in the light. And then David writes a psalm, you know, your words are a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. There's this idea that where there is darkness, there is no light. And that's exactly what he's describing here. The wicked perish because they're away from the light. They're in the darkness. For a person does not prevail by his own strength. Okay? So we are able to, we stand on a firm foundation in the light, and we've done nothing on our own to accomplish either. God accomplishes those things. Those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder in the heavens against them. All right, so there's no profit in opposing God. Well, that is a word that needs to be uttered over and over again today. We are not in a political battle in our country. We're just not. We're in a battle for the opportunity for God to operate freely in the lives of human beings.
Amen. Amen.
That's what this is about. And how is that going to come about? I mean, politically, I don't care. I want to know that we have the freedom to allow God to operate freely in our life if we so choose. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king. He will lift up the horn of his anointed. All right, so here we are. It started with her horn was full and she's lifting it up. A horn was, it's got a lot of different ideas about what that is, but it's obviously the horn that held the anointing oil or some such thing. And here it talks about that he will give power to his king. And of course, the immediate idea here is that this was written after the Davidic kingdom, and so the idea of a king is inserted here because up to this point, there is no king. Or it could be highly prophetic in its nature and points all the way to the king. But nothing leads us to definitively decide which is which. But certainly, if this was edited, it would have been edited thinking of the Davidic line, I would think. So then it says, Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy served the Lord in the presence of the priest Eli. And that's where we're going to stop.
He's a little bitty.
Hmm?
He was a little bitty.
Little bitty guy, yeah.
And that's
Yeah.
where he spent the rest of his.
Never went back home. His family visited him, but he never went back home. He stayed his years right there, serving the Lord. And
What capacity and all that, just.
he became God's man. And very shortly we'll see how God displaced Eli's family completely. In fact, displaced them presently and for any future. Yeah. And
And Eli, right?
and Eli, yeah. And then of course Samuel becomes the judge of the people, and ultimately takes on the role of judge and prophet, priest. He has many roles as he progresses with the life of the nation. And of course, you know, the whole episode with Saul and then with David, and he's kind of having to negotiate some of that. So he's a really strong figure. And the nation might have been different without him. Certainly would have been different. But see how God does? He's got this system. I mean, he appointed the Levites, right? To be the priest.
Mhm.
Okay? And by the time they get to Eli, he says, man, I got to do away with this plan. These people are not getting the job done. And so he picks Samuel. I mean, who's just, what is Samuel? He's the product of a promise. All God has to do is promise something. And that's done. Same thing with Abraham. Same thing with Hannah. He makes a promise. Yeah, that's what I'm going to do for her. She don't even know it. But that's what he does. She feels peace about it. She's unloaded herself to God. She knows that she's been heard. She's not despondent anymore. Sure enough, she conceives a child. And she knows exactly what's going on. Because she had such confidence in God. She didn't go back and say, I wonder if this was God. Scratching her head. Maybe it wasn't God. Maybe I can keep this job. She never does any of that. She has such confidence in God. Even though she leaves that encounter, and all that we know is that she feels better about herself. And then sure enough, God provides. And then from that, God is able to use this person to warn the nation, to prepare them for, the king that he's chosen. And they go through that whole tragic thing with Saul. And you look at these things and you think, what's God doing? Sometimes you look at it and you think, what in the world's he up to? But it all teaches us something. It all prepares for something else.
For every evil person, he had a
There's this double motion.
powerful person.
Yeah, there's this double motion that God's always doing. That says, I'm doing this over here, but it's gonna affect something over here. So you've got to be paying attention to everything I am, everything I'm doing, everything I'm saying, because both are going to have an effect on you. And that's the same thing in our life. He moves in this, but he's saying, but you need to be paying attention because something else is going to happen in this.
Well, everything's tricky. See, now look at this with Samuel. Okay, so Hannah's